see. This usually takes a couple seconds. I've got some slow internet over here. So yeah, once we actually go live, I'm going to quote disappear, and so it's all going to be you, but I'm going to be here monitoring the feed and everything. So
how do you want to deal with Q&A at the end? Are you going to read off the chat if there are any, or?
yeah, I will. If any come through, I will definitely read them off.
Okay.
I'll also be monitoring if there's any comments or anything that come through during the live stream.
Okay, sounds good.
So, okay, well, here we go. All right, good evening and welcome to our August virtual lecture. Sorry that we are starting a little late. There were some technical difficulties on my end, but I believe we have gotten those all straightened out. So today we have Dr. Jennifer Saruda, who's a PhD from the University of Tennessee up in Knoxville. And she is going to be talking to us tonight about pollinators and how they can be beneficial to farmers, on their farms. So Jennifer, the time is yours.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I'll just say hello for a second, but I'm at home and my home internet is a little bit sketchy, so I'm going to turn the video off until the end, but I am here live with you all. And so thank you so much for making time this evening to learn about pollinators and their value, as well as their health issues and what we can do about that. So I just want to take a few moments to talk about the value of pollinators. And so I know this slide's a little bit wordy and heavy, but I just want to point out, if we just look at those pictures at the top, what we see over here on the left-hand side is what your breakfast looks like with pollinators, and on the right-hand side, what your breakfast looks like without pollinators. And you can see that there are some obvious things missing, like the fruits and the jam and the fruit juice. And then you can see there's some dried fruits missing, but also those tree nuts like almonds. So almonds are heavily dependent upon insect pollinators like honeybees. We also have the creamer missing from the coffee, and depending on the type of coffee, there's actually a benefit of pollinators to coffee production as well. So there are also some indirect effects in terms of the creamer, because the bees are pollinating the food that goes into the livestock feed. So not directly pollinating cows, but helping produce the food that feeds them so they can produce the dairy and milk that we use for our creamer. And so the estimate, if you like numbers instead of pictures, is that about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you consume has somehow benefited through animal pollination. And so that can be direct or indirect. And also, when we think about this in terms of the value of these crops, in the United States, the crops that benefit through insect pollination are worth over $29 billion. So it's a huge part of our economy. And then when we look at it in an even finer scale, honeybees are responsible for about 2/3 of that pollination. So they're a really important pollinator in our managed systems. When we think about the value of pollinators, especially insect pollinators and bees, we're oftentimes thinking about fruits and vegetables, and that's why we think of them as being so helpful for a healthy diet. So here we can see some of the common fruits and vegetables, we're technically eating the fruits of the plants here that are grown around this region. And so we have a lot of squashes or cucurbits, also have a lot of berries around, and then also some apples in certain areas. And so these are all really important for not only to have these insects pollinating these, for us to have healthy fruits, but also in terms of being food sources for those bees and other types of pollinators, which we'll get into in just a second. So while we think about these, oftentimes we picture pollination and pollinators, there are also benefits in terms of seed production and oil production through those seeds. And so canola is one of the seeds that we use oftentimes for oil, and we get that oil through pressing the seed, which is then produced because those flowers get pollinated by bees. And so there are many other examples of the value of bees and insect pollinators on seed production, which you can see here on this poster from the Pollinator Partnership on the left-hand side. And oftentimes, even if it's not the seed that we're eating, in order for us to have future crop production, we have to have additional seed being produced, or sometimes we need hybridized seed being produced. And so things even like some of the fruits and vegetables out there, we may need hybridized seeds for things like carrots, where we'd actually have insects like bees doing the pollination to create that hybridized stock for us. And then also when we think more about other types of areas, not just the agricultural landscape, but about natural areas and conservation landscapes, there are a lot of other types of plants out there that also need pollination services, either directly for their own production or because they then serve as food resources for some types of wildlife. And so in some areas, those wildlife can be a little bit destructive, but that's why it's nice for them to have their food sources out in nature where they can stay and where they belong and don't cause as much destruction. And then also sometimes these pollinators themselves can serve as food resources for those wildlife. So when we think about things like birds, they're oftentimes feeding on the larvae and sometimes the adults of these insects. And that's okay as long as we have nice, healthy populations of these insects. There are some to spare. So going back though, thinking about these different types of food crops and the value of these pollinators, when we look at where the different crops that we consume frequently, where they're actually from, most of them are not native to North America or the United States. And so what we're seeing here is a fairly recent paper that was published showing these origins of these different food crops. And you can see North America does have some really great food crops that are native to this land. But in order for us to have a really diverse, healthy diet, we do bring in and grow crops that are originally from other areas. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to have diverse pollinators to help pollinate all of these different crops. And some of our pollinators, like honeybees, are not native to North America, but they're native to areas where some of these other crops originate from. So here's just another nice poster for the Pollinator Partnership. Every year they come out with a beautiful poster, and so I always try to show these because they're better than any drawings that I could make in PowerPoint, but also just showing the impacts of pollinators on more than just agriculture. There's food security, yes, but also there's importance for them in terms of soil health and water resources, also just in terms of biodiversity and how they keep the ecosystem in check. So they're just part of this larger ecosystem. And so they're important beyond just humans and food production. So I think that's just something important that we can think about. And also when we talk about pollinators in general, we have many different types of pollinators out there in the world. And here you can see this another poster that has really diverse pollinators, many of which are not here in the United States, but are still really important for some of the food crops that are grown internationally and then imported into the United States. One that's not pictured here though is the wind. So the wind is really important for a lot of our grains, a lot of our row crops, but we also have a lot of crops that do not rely on wind and actually need different types of animal pollinators. And those animal pollinators, again, can be really diverse too. You can have bats, you can have birds, but also insects. And so here you can see this collage of many different types of insects. There's some bees in there, there are some wasps, there's some flies, there are some beetles. Many different types of insects are coming into contact with flowers and moving that pollen around. And that's essentially what's happening with pollination is they're moving pollen from male parts of flowers to the stigma, the female parts of the flowers to fertilize them and then produce a fruit. But they may not be doing this on purpose. It can be happening accidentally just through their movement on the flower heads. And that's one of the reasons why we look at and focus on bees as pollinators, especially honeybees, is that they have a really special relationship with these flowering plants because they're actually consuming the pollen and the nectar from these flowers. And so I just want to point out though that we do have many different types of bees out in the world. And so it's estimated that in North America, we have about 4,000 species. We probably don't have all of them found or described yet. But we do focus a lot on honeybees because they are the major managed pollinator that we use in the United States and in many countries for their pollination services because they have some advantages. So there are opportunities to move colonies of honeybees around where that's much harder to do with some of these native bee species, as important as they are. They're not quite as mobile and they can be a little bit harder to get into areas. It'll take a longer time to encourage them into a landscape. That's not to say that we can't do it, it just takes a little bit longer. So just different types of bees have different advantages and disadvantages, which we'll talk about in just a second. But what's really great is that these bees are collecting pollen all over their bodies. And so here we can just see 4 different types of bees collecting pollen on different parts of their body. So here we have this honeybee up here collecting this nice pollen ball that she's mixed with some nectar. So it looks like Play-Doh or putty on the tibia. And then you can see actually some of these native bees are collecting the pollen just loosely as individual pollen grains on their legs, or on their thorax, or on these rigid hairs on the undersides of their abdomens. But no matter what, they are really great in terms of coming into contact with that pollen because they use it as a protein resource to feed their developing young, their offspring. And then they're also using the carbohydrates from the nectar as their basically their energy source or their sugar source. So we're going to talk about those in just a second as well. But I just wanted to point out specifically with honeybees, if we take a little bit closer look at their morphology and their body parts, they actually have these specialized structures on their legs. They have this indentation, which we call a pollen basket, where that ball of pollen fits perfectly. There's some rigid hairs on there that they can then stick that pollen onto. And then they also have, it's blown up, it's hard to see in this picture on the left, so it's blown up here in the upper right. They have a press and a rake, and that allows them to groom the pollen grains off their body and push it into that nice little ball once they mix it with nectar and push it into or onto this pollen basket indentation on their leg. Another really cool thing about honeybees is that they have these branched hairs. So they are really fuzzy, hairy insects. And because their hairs are actually branched, it creates a really perfect system for those pollen grains to get stuck all over their bodies. So they are just pollen magnets. When we talk about nectar collection, oh, sorry, I took this picture out, so don't worry about the mandukas. But when we talk about nectar collection, you can see this honeybee here is working this flower head, and she has this proboscis, which is her tongue, and she's sticking that into the flower head, and she's sucking the nectar up. And so that nectar, again, has sugars in it, and that's serving as their carbohydrate resource. And if you look closely, you may actually be able to see that there are individual pollen grains on the hairs on this bee, because when she comes into contact with this flower, there are little pollen grains there as well. And so sometimes even when they are collecting nectar, they're still actually moving pollen grains around. And again, that's one of the reasons why they are such great pollinators. Another great thing about honeybees specifically is that, as I mentioned before, we can move their colonies around in these structures, these wooden boxes, or we have hives of them that we move around. And so you may not realize, or you may realize, that we actually have migratory beekeepers, commercial beekeepers who move their bees around the United States to pollinate specific crops at specific times of the year. And so one of the big crops, and I showed you a picture in that breakfast with and without pollinators, are those almonds. And so almonds are a huge industry. And so they require about 2 million honeybee colonies out in California in February and March. But there's not enough land or sustainable floral resources to keep all those colonies there year round. So those bees actually belong in different states, but they get moved out there for those pollination contracts. And some beekeepers will do multiple rounds or multiple crops in terms of pollination. So these dashed lines show some examples of some different migratory routes beekeepers take. And some will just do one crop. Some of them will make enough off of the almond pollination and just stick with that. Some do many different routes here, as you can see. But that's one of the advantages of these honeybees, is that we can move them around to do these pollination services. Also, another benefit about honeybees specifically is that we can get other types of products out of them, not just pollination services, but of course, they're honeybees for reasons, because they produce an excess of honey that we can actually extract out and use for different purposes, whether it be just consumption through cooking or just using as a dressing. But there's also implications for using them in terms of medical bandages. And this is used not only for humans, but also for other types of animals. And then we also have the use of pollen. So some people will actually consume small bits of pollen for some allergy reasons. And for that, I always tell people make sure you talk to your doctor before implementing this, because if you have a severe allergy, you have to be very careful about how you do this so you don't make your situation worse. There's also the wax that gets produced by honeybees. So they are actually making the wax that they use to build their honeycomb structure. And so we can actually collect that from those colonies and use it to make candles, or use it in terms of making soaps and lotions. Lots of different benefits through that wax production. And then also mead, which is a honey wine. So actually it's related to the honey. So we can actually ferment the honey into a sweet wine. So these are just some other advantages that we can get out of honeybees. So it's a kind of a nice system if you aren't doing just pollination services. If you wanted to get into honey production, there are some different implications or pathways you could take, but also in terms of being a successful beekeeper, oftentimes having a diverse portfolio of products that you produce from your hives can really help in terms of balancing out your offerings. Pollination services oftentimes requires hundreds, if not thousands of colonies. So it's not something that you jump into as a beginner. You usually start out with just keeping some colonies around and then trying to build up over time. And then as you're building up, you will have excess honey being produced. So it's kind of a stepwise or kind of a gateway into some larger scale beekeeping if you so choose. So I mentioned all of these different types of benefits of honeybees, but again, I want to go back to about the importance of bee diversity in terms of pollination services. And so there still are benefits to having native bees and honeybees in the same agricultural landscape. In terms of conservation, we probably want to be more careful in terms of introducing some non-native honeybees into really sensitive areas. But in agricultural areas, especially where we're trying to get pollination of some of these non-native crops, it makes sense to have some non-native honeybees around. But still, we have these data from different experiments and different crop systems, in this case sunflowers, showing how actually having different types of bees around, whether it be bumblebees and honeybees, having the bumblebees actually helps move the honeybees from flower to flower more, thereby enhancing the pollination of the sunflowers themselves. And this has been shown actually in many different crop systems. So here's another one looking at blueberries. We're actually looking at many different types of pollinators and how they function, explains how you can get higher benefits or yields in your blueberry crop. And so because there are differences in numbers of bees, so one advantage of honeybees is you can put out a colony that has 50,000 bees in it, whereas if you're relying on native bees and you may not have many in your area, you may not get sufficient pollination. But honeybees are oftentimes not the most efficient bee for many of these crop systems. Some of the native bees do a better job per visit. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. And then the activity patterns. There are some bees that perform under different types of weather conditions, poorer weather conditions than maybe honeybees do. There's differences in visitation rate. And then again, you can have these different species interacting that can then increase the overall yield. So we want to make sure that we're valuing all of these different bees in terms of their contribution overall to these pollination systems. And I just want to take a couple moments to talk about some of these different types of bees, because it makes us think a bit more about how we manage our lands. And so when we think about bees, we're oftentimes thinking about them on flowers, but for most of the solitary bees, they're actually nesting in the ground. And so sometimes people will see this picture and they just think, oh, these must be like earthworm castings, but these are actually from native bees that are nesting in the ground. And here you can see one opening that's pretty clear and not surrounded by a bunch of castings there. And when we look close up, you can see these bees, they're pretty quick about getting into their little nest site. So you oftentimes don't see them entering in and out. They spend most of their time either in there unloading or out foraging, and they aren't dilly-dallying around once they actually get to their nest site itself. Occasionally, though, you'll have some larger openings depending on the size of the bee. There are different types of ground nesting bees. Some of them are very small, some of them are larger, and some of them will actually nest in aggregations. So this is obviously, you would notice this probably in your yard, where you have many of these solitary bees nesting together on one site. they still have individual nests, but they're nesting because of that nice, their qualities about the soil that they are really attracted to. And so this makes for a good site for them. And so this, when we see this, we want to think too about how we're dealing with our ground landscaping, and thinking about, if we are going to mulch, we want to make sure that we aren't putting too thick of a mulch, so that we can have access, or the bees will have access to the soil and being able to nest below. Just thinking about that too, in terms of how are we dealing with things like weeds. If we're spraying pesticides into the ground, even if they are things like herbicides, they can actually have impacts on insects. It's not just insecticides that can harm bees. And so we want to be conscious of that and careful. Also thinking about some of these other types of native bees actually nest in stems. And so thinking too about how we manage our land. And I just want to quickly go through this. I'm not going to read this all, but I'll leave this so you can read it. But just thinking about when we are growing habitat for some of these native bees, it's not just about growing floral resources for that nectar and pollen, but it is that we're leaving some of these stems behind. We're cutting them down, but we're leaving them exposed. So they have these empty, pithy stems that the bees will hollow out, and they'll actually use that for nesting. And so this is just something to keep in mind in terms of how we keep our plants. And it's oftentimes not the way most people would think is desirable aesthetically. No one wants to have these stalks left behind. They think it looks untidy, but that's actually functional in terms of promoting the stem nesting bees and their populations in the environment. So sometimes we have to think about what we like or what we prefer versus what's really better for the habitat for some of these stem nesting bees. So just thinking about that in terms of how we're managing our habitats for different types of bees. And then I just wanted to share a couple research studies that point to the importance of these wildflower strips and having additional habitat in farm systems, not only because some farmers will think, oh, if I put the pollinator strips out there or wildflower strips, the bees are just going to go to the wildflower strips and they aren't going to actually visit the plots or the crops that I need pollination for. And that's actually not true. So there's different ways in which we want to be careful about how we do this. But really, if we're trying to plant to create healthy pollinators, you're going to have larger pollinator populations that can then do more effective pollination of your crops. So we have scientific research showing this too. So it's really important. And then also thinking too about, if you're a farmer, maybe there are some ways you can build this into your production and your system. And so there are some farmers that are actually using these wildflower strips as a way to then produce wildflower seed and then selling that as well. So another kind of idea of diversifying operations. So just a really cool way. I think that we can all win or benefit just by how we manage our habitats and thinking about thinking ahead, I guess, for the future and not just the present. And so even if it's a landowner or non-farmer, there are still benefits to those folks in terms of planting pollinator habitat, in terms of just the ecosystem itself. And so you don't have to be a beekeeper to put in pollinator habitat. I always encourage everyone who wants to support bees or those who eat healthy diets and rely on bees on a day-to-day basis to think about how they can improve and help make an impact in terms of improving pollinators through providing healthy habitats for them. And so some of these other benefits, though, in case people need more convincing, is that by providing these or converting areas into pollinator habitat, you can actually protect the quality of the soil and the land by mitigating runoff and not having that issue of losing topsoil and that soil erosion. But also by creating this habitat, you're providing a refuge for some insects that provide biocontrol. So some of these great insects that are natural enemies of pest insects. And then also it can help prevent weeds depending on what you're actually planting. So a lot of our cover crops are a great way that we can actually decrease weeds by also providing food resources and habitat for pollinators. And of course, in my mindset at least, I think it improves the aesthetics of the land as opposed to having just undesirable flowering plants, or AKA weeds, or just having bare soil, or areas that don't look as pleasant. Might as well try to make it beautiful and functional at the same time. And so there's just some additional benefits that I think we can all think about in terms of trying to increase and improve the habitat for pollinators, which then improves the larger scale of agriculture and food security for us humans. So there's a little bit of a selfish perspective in that as well. And then when we manage our lands, one thing to think about is the use of pesticides. I already hinted at that in terms of the use of herbicides, but we also want to be careful when we do see pest insects, that we're trying to be careful about what types of insecticides we use and how we use them, so that we aren't causing additional risk and exposure for these valuable bees that we're trying to then increase numbers of. And so this is the University of California's Bee Precaution Rating website. And I can share this link at the end. This is a nice website where you can look up different types of pesticides, and it'll tell you what the effects are on bees and whether they're toxic to honeybee brood, the developing bees, as well as to other bee species. And so this is beyond the label. So the label is always the law when it comes to using any kind of pesticide, but this provides you additional information, even more than what the label provides. One thing I will point out, though, is that this is a California database, so not all of the pesticides that are in their database are legal to use in Tennessee, and vice versa. Not all of our legal to use pesticides are going to be in their database. But California does have a rather large database, so most of what we use here in Tennessee can be found in their database. But I just wanted to make sure that you all realize that you have to be careful about only using pesticides that are registered in Tennessee, but a great resource. And then when we think about, if people want to get into beekeeping, I just want to point out, I've mentioned a lot of the positive things about them and how beneficial they are for agriculture and farming, but we do need to have spend a little bit of time thinking about or discussing some of the issues and concerns regarding especially honeybees, and because we have data for them. And so when we look at the national honeybee losses, we have many surveys across the United States. And so this is one of them that has some preliminary data. We have a survey every year, and every so often we actually write it up in terms of a publication. But we look at the data across the years of the survey, and I realize this is a lot to look at, but we look at the winter losses, we look at the summer losses, and then we look at the overall losses for the year in honeybee colonies across the entire United States. This is all averaged, and this is averaged amongst different scales of beekeepers as well. And so what you can see here is that there's not a super obvious trend, and that's one of the problems, is that we have high levels of losses. So when we look at this, we're looking at about 40% annual losses, and in most systems, especially in agricultural systems, that would not be considered very sustainable. That's problematic, and these numbers are jumping around and they vary from season. This is one of the reasons why we need to spend more time researching and educating beekeepers to be as responsible as they can, to try to figure out what the actual cause of some of these losses are. And they will be different in different regions, and they'll be different in different years as well. But this is just kind of a snapshot in terms of looking at the really high losses of honeybee colonies across the United States. And so I'll just point out too that in Tennessee, most of the beekeepers are hobbyists and backyard beekeepers. So we have many beekeepers keeping relatively few colonies, whereas in some of these states, you'll have really large scale commercial beekeepers who will keep tens of thousands of colonies. And so there's just a different scale of beekeepers depending on what state you're in. But one thing that we see commonly with backyard beekeepers and hobbyists is they don't know why they're losing their colonies. And when you ask them, the third most common answer in the survey is that they don't know why they lost their colonies. And so that's a big area of concern for us in terms of trying to educate and figure out what is actually underlying their losses. And so I can just point out really quickly here that we do have many different types of pests and diseases across the United States, but especially here in the Southeast, we have a lot of problems. We have some microsporidiae and bacterial infections. We have small hive beetles that can get into colonies, and they'll actually feed on the developing, all the eggs and the developing bees, as well as the food stores, and they'll ferment the food stores as well. And sometimes the bees will actually abscond and leave the colony behind because of the food resources or stores being so damaged. And then we have wax moths, which will come into a weaker colony, and they'll start to invade and take over, and they create webbing, and it's an entire mess, and it's really hard to come back from some of these issues with pests as well as with these pathogens. And so we do have viruses, and that's what's actually in this picture right here. But a better way to look at those viruses is by looking at this bee down here who has what's called deformed wing virus. And so this is a virus that gets spread by these parasitic varroa mites. It can exist on its own, but it's oftentimes seen in conjunction with these varroa mites, which also spread many other different types of viruses. We have over 20 different viruses in honeybees. But this deformed wing virus is found in many honeybee colonies, and most honeybee colonies. And you can see once this bee emerges out as an adult bee with these little deformed wings, she's not going to be an effective flyer. She's not going to be very good in terms of collecting food resources, collecting that nectar and pollen. She's just not going to have a very long life after this point of emerging out. And so these are just some of the issues. And so I just want to point these out to remind everyone that it's, as much as everyone gets excited about bees and beekeeping, which is fantastic, there are many challenges, especially at those beginning stages. And so it's not for the faint of heart, because you will likely have high losses in the beginning stages. But we do provide assistance for you all, or we try to at least. So I run the Tennessee Master Beekeeping Program here at UT. It's one of our many master's programs, and we have different levels of it, but we want to make sure that we're providing beekeepers with science-based information to make sure that they're following best management practices so that they're going to be successful, not only for the beekeeper to be successful with their beekeeping, but one of the things that I'm really concerned about is just keeping bees from dying. It breaks my heart when I see colonies that I know are going to be off to a bad start because there's not good education with beekeepers who are starting out. Many beekeepers will get colonies and then try to figure it out as they go on. And this is, keeping bees is not like getting a pet cat or a dog. They don't get, they don't sneeze, they don't have runny eyes, they don't have a lot of the symptoms that we're used to seeing in mammals. And so it's really hard for us to detect the issues until they're like pretty far down the line. And it's really a lot harder for us to recover from that. But I do want to point out that we do cover these topics in the Master Beekeeping class to provide you assistance in terms of recognizing these problems, but also how to remedy them. We also have, I apologize, another very busy chart here, or slide. Just wanted to let you know that you aren't alone in your beekeeping, and that there are many resources across the state to help you if you get started. And so here we are. I'm at the UT Institute of Agriculture. I'm part of Extension, but we also have a research division. And we do education, we also do outreach, and we have research, and we have county extension offices with agents all across the state that can assist you. And so they are the first point of contact if you have beekeeping questions. And then if they can't answer the questions, then they get in touch with me, and then I answer for them. And we have a whole system lined up, or a process, so that we can assist you efficiently and effectively. And then I can't ignore the importance of the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. So they handle inspections as well as the hive registry, which is mandatory but free in Tennessee. And this actually provides you protection from things like liability. So it's really important that everyone registers their hives. And also permits for moving hives within the state as well as across state lines, because we want to be careful about spreading diseases and pathogens. So we have systems in place there. We also have a really nice ag enhancement program where if you're in beekeeping for 5 or more years and have 15 or more colonies, you can qualify for this cost share program. And there's more information on this chart, and then more information for all of these different subgroups are on my website, and the link is down here too. And then especially if people are dealing with issues related to pesticide use, or they think they have a honeybee colony lost because of pesticide use, the Department of Agriculture has a division to handle that. And so this is their phone number. We want to make sure everybody knows that, because there's a really short window of opportunity to do an investigation. So if you call me, or if you contact the apiary inspector, we're not the right people to contact, and we're probably going to slow you. We probably won't get back to you in time. So we want to make sure that everyone knows this number to contact first and foremost. And then if you start getting into larger production of honey, then you need to have a certified honey house. And so there's another division that handles that. So lots of different areas of support for different types of beekeeping operations and different levels of beekeeping operations. Just wanted to point that out, that you're not alone, and we do have many programs in the state to assist you. And some of these offerings don't exist in other states, like this ag enhancement program. Few, if any, other states provide that type of cost share for beekeepers. So I also want to point out that you can also download a free copy of Beekeeping in Tennessee. It's a nice booklet that UT Extension has put out. So just Google UT Extension publications, and then once you click on the link for publications and multimedia, you can search for Beekeeping in Tennessee, or any other topic that you're interested in with regards to extension programming. So, you know, if you're interested in gardening, you can look up some of the Master Gardener fact sheets. We have all kinds of information. And so I always point people to this as a nice resource to start looking for different types of fact sheets and science-based information. But this is a free download. If you want to order a paper copy, it's $7 plus tax, but shipping is free. So different ways to access it, but it's a nice way to start out, but nothing replaces the importance of taking an actual beekeeping class. So I highly encourage everyone to take the Master Beekeeping class. You don't have to be a master beekeeper in order to take it. It's just, we are giving you the resources and information and knowledge to master your beekeeping skills to be successful. Also want to point out just a little bit of a snapshot of what beekeeping in Tennessee actually looks like. So we have about 7,500 registered beekeepers in Tennessee, and here you can see where the apiary, the hot spots of apiaries, and an apiary is actually a site where you keep multiple colonies of bees. And so you can see that we have some hot spots across the state, and we have about 42,000 registered colonies belonging to about 7,500 registered beekeepers. And this is from the Department of Ag through their registry information. But we also have across the state helpful resources too, in that we have local beekeeping associations. So there's about, it always changes, somewhere between 45 and 49 at any given time. And their website is tnbeekeepers.org. And so sometimes you're in an area where you can actually be a member of multiple, or at least attend multiple clubs. They usually have monthly meetings where they'll have a speaker talking about a topic of interest for that time of the year. And so I highly encourage, if people are getting into beekeeping, to join their local clubs, not only for the content, but to find a mentor to work with in those beginning years, or even as you're continuing. It always helps to have a mentor to bounce ideas off of. The other thing I wanted to point out is that we have many different conferences and resources across the state as well. So over here on the left-hand side are some of the field days that UT offers. And so these are some old ones, but you can find the current and upcoming field days at agresearch.tennessee.edu/field-days. And so there's some of these are going to be in person, like I believe the Fall Gardeners Festival at the Plateau Research and Education Center will be August 31st, and that'll be in person as far as we know. So lots of great opportunities to learn about agriculture and pollinators, and then specifically about honeybees. We have the State Beekeeping Association has their annual conference the second week of October. I believe it's the 8th and 9th this year. I forget the numbers, but it's a Friday and Saturday. It's either 8th and 9th or 9th and 10th in Murfreesboro. And so you can find out more information on their website. And then we also have the Pick Tennessee conference, which is an agricultural conference that also has a beekeeping session there. And its website is picktnconference.com. And that's the third week of February in Franklin, Tennessee. So really great opportunities to learn more beyond just beekeeping, but also just about agriculture in general. And then getting towards the end, just wanted to point out too that we do have a national extension website that has a sub-site about bee health. So there are resources there as well. There are some old documented or old archived webinars, but there's also some digested scientific information in there just about how to get started, as well as some of these pests and pathogens that we deal with in the beekeeping community. And then also wanting to point out too, in terms of diversity and differences in abilities, I just want to point out that regardless of whether or not you want to get into beekeeping or not, the AgriBility website has a toolbox where you can look up tools to help people with diverse abilities in terms of agriculture. And so they actually, if you look up beekeeping, they do have some helpful tools in there to help you make beekeeping a little bit easier. So just wanted to point that out. Many people don't realize that this resource exists, and it's really helpful. And then I think lastly, I'll point out that if you are looking for help with insect identification, this is another one where, as I mentioned before, your county extension agent is your first line of defense and resource and contact. And so we do have a distance diagnostic service. So if you have a photo of an insect that you want to have identified, you can email it to your county extension agent, and then they can send it through a distance diagnostic system to actually get it identified. Just wanted to point that out because we had a ton of photos sent in last year as well as this year about Asian giant hornets, which we do not have in Tennessee. We have plenty of these European hornets though that look very similar. And so always trying to point out the differences here. And then this time of year, we start having more and more of these eastern cicada killers as well. Also very large, but not at all the same worry as with the Asian giant hornet. So if you ever have an insect that you think you need some help identifying, I would recommend that you take a good quality digital photo and then send it to your county extension agent, and they can help get that identified for you. And so with that, I thank you for your time. And I guess I'll ask Seth now where we are with time. If we have time for questions, or if there are any questions, then we can try to get to them.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. It's been a very informative lecture for myself. My family had bees several years ago, so it was nice to kind of get a refresher, if you will, on this topic. As of this time, I am not seeing any questions coming through.
Okay.
So if questions come through, because I've advertised and so people can contact our organization directly. If any questions do come through, do you mind if I email them to you and forward them on?
Yes, but it would be also helpful to email the extension agents as well. So we're working on training the extension agents in terms of increasing their knowledge about bees. And so we want to keep them in the loop as well.
All right, that sounds good. So yeah, I mean, that's where we're standing with questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for everyone's time this evening. I hope you all are staying safe, and hopefully we'll get a little bit more rain coming up.
I hear you. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a good rest of the evening.
Thanks, you too. Night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Goodbye.